I read John Gardner's Grendel, and I thought it was interesting. And then I saw the movie Maleficent, which I thought wasn't. And then I went to the musical Wicked, and I said to myself, hey, something's going on here. Each of these stories takes a villain from a familiar story, Beowulf, Sleeping Beauty, and The Wizard of Oz, respectively, and then it explores the backstory of these antagonists and their motivations, and in so doing, it offers a more sympathetic perspective. And these aren't the only stories that do this. And the children's animated genre is exploring this same theme as well. And now we have Wicked the movie, which will make this story about the Wicked Witch of the West familiar to a far broader range of viewers. So I think it's safe to say that we have a trend on our hands. We're reinterpreting villains or exploring their origins. And we're also challenging notions of good and evil. So now we empathize with these characters. But is there a downside to this trend? I think there is, or at least one behind it. But before we discuss that, let's consider what this new sort of story says about ourselves and the world in which we think we live. The modern trend of reinterpreting villains in popular culture is more than just a storytelling gimmick. It's a reflection of a changing worldview. At its core, this trend shows that we like moral complexity. Gone are the days of clear-cut heroes and villains. Our culture has moved away from thinking about good and evil in absolutes. And our contemporary stories reflect and spur that shift. By humanizing characters traditionally cast as evil, we confront our own biases and the process of othering in our society. So one way to look at this trend of reinterpreted villains is as a mirror of our society's movement toward a more nuanced, empathetic, and critical worldview, one which reflects our collective desire to understand rather than judge, to explore complexity rather than accept simplicity, and to challenge rather than conform to traditional narratives. So that's the story with a positive spin. What's the downside of Wicked and the stories like it? To some extent, the stories we tell now are a reaction to the stories we used to tell. And obviously, we as a society are happy with the change, because the change is in line with our contemporary values. We've abandoned the old ways of thinking, and have adopted new ways of thinking, and we easily assume that these new ones are superior in every way to the old ones. We always think, without much discernment, that new is always better. Sometimes it isn't. And then there's the Christian perspective. What is that? Maybe there are some Christians out there that quickly declare all these retellings as profoundly unbiblical, unchristian, because these stories are just more evidence of all the moral blurring that they perceive in culture. But I'm not sure that's really a Christian perspective. Let's think about it. Our culture has moved away from thinking about good and evil in absolute forms. But are moral absolutes actually biblical? Even though the Bible often speaks of the righteous and the wicked, these terms aren't really absolutes. Only God is pure good, and there can't be anyone or anything that is absolutely evil. No, not even Satan. He was created good by God, right? So he can't be pure evil. And let's look at all those big heroes of the Bible. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, David, Paul. Every character from the Bible that we know even a little bit, we know they're not always good. Jesus? Jesus is the only one. It's not the Bible that gives us pure good and pure evil characters. It's Disney. On the story level, Wicked and Cruella are good. They're well told. But on a worldview level, I might have some issues. The worldview behind many of these new stories is just as wrong as the worldview behind the old ones. Where the old ones lacked complexity, the new ones lack clarity. Let's look at how one author conceives of evil in a much more nuanced way than either of these, and manages to present evil in a way that is consistent with how we experience it in our lives. We are, of course, talking about J.R.R. Tolkien. The way he deals with evil avoids both the simplistic othering of the old tales and the moral ambiguities of our modern culture. First, Tolkien doesn't give us a simple battle between clear good and clear evil. Well, some might say, well, what about Sauron? He's pure evil. What we must remember about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and what we must understand about our own time, is that it's not the whole story. It's just a part of it. Tolkien's big story started a long time before Hobbits. Sauron had noble beginnings. He was called Merian, which means the admirable. He was a powerful Maya spirit who came to Arda to help shape the world. He was initially a pure and orderly being dedicated to the craft of forging. J.R.R. Tolkien's conception of evil is heavily influenced by Augustinian theology. At its core, his view of evil is not as a separate, independent force, but rather as a privation. It is the absence of good. So in Tolkien's mythology, evil arises from the corruption of initially good beings through their own choices. So free will is the reason we have evil in the world. Again, evil is portrayed as a lack of goodness and a distortion of what's good. It cannot create in the same sense as giving life. It can only destroy and pervert and mock. This concept is often symbolized in Tolkien's work through the imagery of shadows and darkness. Darkness requires light to exist, but light doesn't need darkness to exist. This conception of evil is also presented in the orcs. They were likely created from elves, but twisted and distorted. They were intended by Morgoth to be a mockery of the elves, the children of Ilúvatar. And because of their origin, even orcs are shown with some moral complexity. Speaking of Morgoth, the origin of evil in Tolkien's world is tied to the desire for power beyond what one is meant to have. We see this in the fall of Melkor, later called Morgoth, who was the most powerful of the Ainur. These were the spiritual beings created by Eru Ilúvatar before the beginning of the world. It was Morgoth's rebellion against the divine plan that introduces discord into the world. He in turn corrupts Sauron. Sauron wanted power and became obsessed with becoming a god king, and this drove him to do all kinds of evil, including the forging of the One Ring, the symbol of corruption and power and the will to dominate the other. The Lord of the Rings isn't simply a battle between the forces of good and evil. So much of the war is fought within the hearts of people, or other beings. Gandalf and Galadriel both have to resist the lure of the ring. Saruman, who arguably has even more natural power, fails to resist. The brothers Boromir and Faramir are both tempted by the ring as well. Boromir succumbs. Faramir almost succumbs, but ends up choosing the path of good. Aragorn has been worried for over a century about how he will respond to the ring's allure. Thankfully, he passes. The point is that characters in Tolkien aren't inherently evil, but they all have the potential to be drawn into evil. Interestingly, once someone has declared for Team Evil, that doesn't mean that we can write them off. We see this in Boromir, who was redeemed just before his death, and Saruman, when redemption is offered, he refuses. And Gollum. He struggles back and forth between Smeagol and his ring identity, Gollum. Redemption is a possibility. And one more thing. Despite its destructive nature, Tolkien believed that even evil could serve some good in the divine plan. This is illustrated in moments like Gollum's role in the destruction of the ring, where even the actions of a corrupted creature ultimately contribute to a greater good. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, good and evil are not abstract concepts or relative moral positions. They are objective forces that shape the world and its inhabitants. Tolkien presents evil as having tangible consequences in his world. It manifests in the physical corruption of the land, the creation of monstrous creatures, and the moral decay of individuals. I give you Sauron, the Nazgul, and Gollum. These are examples of how evil can twist. In Tolkien's fantasy world, you just can't take evil lightly. And we shouldn't in our world either. But we kinda do. We think we've outgrown the category of evil. I'm not bashing Wicked or any story like it which explores the backstory and perspectives of a traditional villain. But in the context of a society that is very skeptical of any absolutes, it's too easy to dismiss evil and write stories that reinforce this dismissal. We need to balance clarity and complexity. We need to do what Tolkien does. Take evil very seriously, but also take good very seriously, and recognize that every human being experiences the struggle between them in our lives. Stories are very powerful. They shape our perceptions and our values, and our very identities. While we celebrate the richness that moral ambiguity brings to our tales, we should also remember the value of moral clarity. Perhaps the most powerful stories are those that manage to walk the line between these two approaches, offering both the nuance we crave and the ethical guidance we need. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.